On this episode of Jesan Sorrells Presents, episode number 34. I almost dropped the book. I'm going to talk about this book. I'm going to talk about industrialists. And I'm going to ask you some compelling questions about why you think the workplace can't and won't change. Welcome to Jesan Sorrells Presents, episode number 34. Episode number 34. All right. So, you all have no idea on the other side of watching this how difficult it has been to put this together today. And not because of anything like, it has nothing to do with Steven. Steven's fine. It has nothing to do with Mark. Mark's fine. Even though Mark walked in a little late. Mark is fine. Tiffany's fine. Nothing to do with the crew here. It's just circumstances. Anyway, so I want to do a riff today, interestingly enough, about circumstances. But I want to talk about the circumstances of your workplace. The fact of the matter is, most of us work in places, in industries, in systems that were built in the 20th century. And 20th century industrialists cared quite a bit about three things. They cared about scaling. They cared about production and revenue. And they cared about a more insidious thing called compliance. The fact of the matter is, school systems exist, K through 12 systems exist, to create compliant workers. Have you ever thought about why you sit in rows in school? Have you ever thought about why you have to raise your hand to get the attention of the teacher? Have you thought about why in the workplace, even if you're doing white-collar work, you very politely sit at your desk and you don't leave. You don't walk around. You don't move around. You and me and everybody else walking around out here, if we went through the K through 12 system, were bred to be compliant. That's not an accident. If you don't believe me, look up a guy named John Dewey and look up his relationship with another guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor, and then look up his relationship with another guy named Henry Ford. Compliance was built into the system because in order to have scale, in order to have growth, you have to have people come in, do the specific cog in the wheel process that they are tasked with doing, and then they go home. Then they leave, and by the way, you pay them a paycheck. Now, from that system, you can grow. That's the industrialization of an idea. So, building a car in your house, in your garage, is infinitely difficult. But here's the other thing that's infinitely difficult on top of that. Building the River Rouge plant, which Henry Ford did back in the 1920s or 1930s. After 150 years of people living, existing, being schooled inside of these systems, is it any wonder that when I go into workplaces and deal with workplace cultures, and I tell people in workplaces, as I've been doing this week and last week and the week before that, the week before that, and the week before that, and it's a growing chorus, not just from me, but from many others, is it any wonder that when I go into these workplaces and these very polite middle managers sit in rows and raise their hand very politely and ask me polite questions and don't really push back or argue with me too much, although some of them will, but not too much. Is it any wonder that those folks, when I tell them, and you out there, that workplace cultures have to change, workplaces have to change, but we don't really believe they can, is it any wonder that when I say that, people get defensive? Because it's the truth. We don't really believe they can. If we believed that workplaces could change, we would actually change our workplaces. We would change the way we interact with each other. We wouldn't focus on compliance. Instead, we would favor innovation over compliance, which requires creative thinking. Instead of focusing on scale, we would actually focus on keeping our teams small and intimate. A team where you can actually know everybody's name, kind of like Cheers, where you have relationships with each other, and you build stuff that matters. Your work that has purpose and meaning. And then we wouldn't be focused on growth at all costs, which is the other thing industrialists focused on in the 20th century. Growth at all costs means you follow a J, we're going to draw a J, curve of growth. But instead, if you really believe workplaces can change, instead you have to focus on linear growth, which means it doesn't matter if you show up to buy something from me tomorrow. It doesn't matter if you show up the day after that, or the day after that, or the day after that. Instead, with a small team focused on linear growth, building slowly over time, that's something where, that's a project, that's a process, that's a product where I don't have to appeal to an industrialist mentality. I don't have to appeal to an industrialist attitude. And quite frankly, I don't have to respond to industrialist pressures, and neither does the business or the team. By the way, there is a tool that allows us to do all this right now, because if I had said this in like 1950 or 1960 or 1970 or even dare I say 1980, this would have all sounded like poppycock. But I'm not saying this in 1950, 1960, 1970 or 1980. I'm saying it in 2018. And you know what has won in 2018? Here's what's won. The internet. The internet just won. The internet proves you don't need 50,000 people spread out across multiple different locations doing work that doesn't matter, being cogs and wheels. The internet proves that growth at all costs, a J curve, may not be the best way to add value. And the internet proves that compliance, just doing what you're told, only works for a very narrow band of rudimentary tasks. But after those tasks are done, which most can be outsourced to low-cost providers in other parts of the world, or can be given to machines, once those tasks are done, what matters, as Dan Pink would say, is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. The things that you don't really get in K through 12. And then when you graduate to your workplace, the things you don't really get in your workplace. Workplace cultures have to change, and I'm not the only person saying this. Look, I don't have this book here by accident. These guys run a company. It's called Basecamp out of Chicago. You should look into them. By the way, you should also buy this book here. It's fabulous, and we'll have a link to it in the annotated thing in the doodly-doot. That's the second doodly-doot I've said today. That's number 2. You can put a count there. But you need to read this book, because these guys are saying exactly what I'm saying. You need to follow them on Medium. You need to listen to their podcast. You need to actually absorb this, because they're actually changing a workplace culture, and they're walking it out in a 10, 15, 20, $30 million business on a yearly basis. So they're not kidding, and they're not joking around. And I know. You'll read the book, and you'll go, well, that's interesting for those guys in Chicago, or that's interesting for those guys over there. But then here's the thing. A guy like me will show up, who's doing it, who's walking it out, and you'll listen to me, and you'll nod very politely, and then you'll go right back into the workplace where compliance, growth at all costs, and scale will still be the things that drive our interactions and our relational moments in the workplace, even if we don't think on a day-to-day basis that that is what is driving them. So do you really want your workplace to change? Or do you just want to give it lip service? All right, that's all I got for today.